right. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to Why Christianity. My name is Olin Giles, and I am your host for this Friday afternoon. Our guest today is Dr. Don Deal. Don is the Director of Classical Apologetics for Norm Geisler International Ministries. He has a master's degree in biblical theological studies from Luther Rice University, a master's degree in biblical theological. Oh, I just said that, didn't I? A master's in Christian Apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary, and a Ph.D. in Islamic Studies from Columbia International University. Don has been studying and teaching apologetics for 25 years. He is a professor of scientific apologetics at Veritas International University and is a member of the scholar community with the Scientific Apologetics Ministry, Reasons to Believe. And he's with us today to discuss what every Christian needs to know about Islamic law. So I'll bring him on here and welcome, Dr. Don Deal. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Olin. As I was thinking about being on here, I just want to let you know quickly that I thought perhaps you might want to consider a different title. The OG.
Yes, that's interesting.
Just in case you want to go for a younger crowd.
Right. I may have to take that advice. We'll see. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today and discuss this topic. I'm really looking forward to it, and I mean that. I have spent a lot of my time the last several years studying Islam, and I have a feeling I'm getting ready to learn a lot of new things as I listen to you. So we'll just jump right into it if that's all right.
That's all right.
Tell us the topic of your dissertation.
Well, interestingly, when I did my dissertation, I learned a lot that I didn't expect to learn about the state of research on Islam. There's a popular view of Islam, and then there's what the scholars are discovering as far as what can be demonstrated historically. And of course, nothing in history is absolute. Because we only have a tiny percentage of what survived at the time. So, but based on the evidence we have available to us now, I discovered that the history was a little different than what I had learned when I studied Islam, just as a general topic. So the topic of my dissertation, this title is The Origin and Development of the Zimma in Islamic Law. Most people call them dhimmis or dhimma, so I'll use that pronunciation. And what I discovered was, as I was studying Islam, there are many books and articles written about the dhimmis and their treatment and how different caliphs and different leaders treated them. And there were a few books written by Muslims discussing the history of the law, but those books were either outdated or they relied on sources that wouldn't withstand a Western historical examination. For example, if you get a source that originates 2 centuries after whatever happened, then you don't have a contemporary source. You don't have something at the time, and there's time for different little errors or accretions, different ideas that are current in the time the book was written, but not relevant to the original time. So what I discovered was that when you discover datable historical sources that are contemporary with the events, that the early history of Islam comes out different than the standard narrative.
I'm tempted to make a few comments there, but I don't want to rabbit trail you. I think
it's however much time you have, Olin, we can go wherever you want. I'll let you know I usually eat dinner in about 3 hours. That's my only limitation.
Right. Well, we won't keep you too long, but I was just thinking as you were sharing all that is, Christianity is built on solid historical grounds. We have contemporary historical sources to back up the Bible, but it's hard to get Muslims to talk about that, but we won't go there now. Tell us how, was there anything in particular that made you just decide on this topic? What led you to research this topic?
Yeah, I think it was about 2011 or so that I started hearing about the Islamic State, ISIS, which is ISIS in the English is Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Anyway, what I heard was at the time was that they were reestablishing the law of the Dhimma on the Christians and religious minorities living there. And they said their purpose in establishing the Islamic State was to rebuild a society that's authentically Islamic, that that most nations that call themselves Islamic had reached a stage that starting with Sayyid Qutb in the 1960s in Egypt, referred to as Jahiliyyah, which is the age of ignorance before Islam. In other words, there's a lot of Middle Eastern countries that give lip service to Islam, but to the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the others who helped found the country or the group, to them, those groups were all in ignorance. They weren't following the correct Islam. And so they were reestablishing this law in which Jews and Christians be required to pay a certain tax, a special tax called a jizya, and that they would have certain clothing restrictions and certain other restrictions. They said this goes back to Muhammad, and I had studied the early history of Islam, and I didn't recall something like that at the time. So I got curious as to exactly how did that law begin, and how did it develop over time. So hence the title of the dissertation. It led me in directions I didn't expect.
These are, these sounds like, a lot of the things that most people don't hear about Islam, and kind of a sensitive topic. But tell us, was there anything in particular that made you start studying Islam? When did or why did you start studying Islam?
Well, for me, I had read a book or two on Islam in the 1990s, but it was after 9/11, like a lot of people, it shocked me. I'll tell you, at the time I was a pilot for a major cargo company. I had just landed from Alaska and got home about 3 o'clock that morning, went to bed, and my brother was living with me at the time. And 8:30 that morning, he came knocking on my door to wake me up, which that's usually a no-no because I need plenty of rest after flying at night and staying up all night. And he said, something's happening. And I went into the living room and watched the planes crash into the World Trade Center and began to follow all that was going on that day. And that got me interested in how did those people think? Why did they think they were doing the right thing? I mean, people do things that seem terrible to others, but the people who do that think it's the good thing to do. Why did they think killing people like that was a good thing to do? So I began to study everything about 9/11 I could find. I'm probably one of the few people who's read the entire 9/11 Commission report. I think that runs about 1,200 pages, and I read the entire thing. And so what I wanted to do was get into the mind of those people and understand better why they thought the way they did. And then after I felt comfortable after several years of study that I understood their thinking and their rationale and what sources they used and how they interpreted the Quran, etc., then I got curious. Well, why don't all the Muslims behave that way? And so I began to study the more mainstream Islam and what the average Muslim and why Muslims in America aren't like that. And discovered that there are two completely different interpretations going on there. And so I was curious about, what are the arguments for each side, and does it make sense? And that got me into studying, of course, the history of Islam, early Islam.
Yeah. Wow. I was, that's about the same time that I started studying Islam. I think, perhaps a lot of people, like you said, it kind of piqued everybody's interest, and everybody kind of remembers where they were at on that day. But I knew you were, a pilot at one time, but I never thought about it from that perspective. just landing a plane and then going to sleep and then being woken, to
Oh yeah,
watch what's happening. That's
it changed my life a lot.
yeah.
We
I'm
went
sure.
from, well, it used to be we'd walk in and show our ID to the guard at the door and just go and set our bags down and go to the airplane after we looked at the paperwork. And after that, we had scanners, we had x-ray machines, we had everything all set up. And we had new rules, what you could and couldn't carry on the airplane, things like that. Who could go on the airplane? I'll give you an example of how, to me, silly it got. I was jump seating, which is there's usually an extra seat in the aircraft, in the FedEx aircraft, where pilots or other people can get or hitch a ride on the flight if there's a seat available. So I was going to go play golf with my buddy, and they took my golf clubs and they put them in the forest compartment in the tail of the aircraft because they told me that those were considered possible weapons.
Wow.
I get up to the cockpit, I sit down, I put on my seatbelt, and I turn to my right, and right off my right shoulder is an axe that's just hanging beside me.
Right.
That's a crash axe to get out of the airplane in case it's on fire. And I thought, so I can use this axe, which has a really pointy end and a really sharp end, is sitting right beside me. But the golf clubs are dangerous, but this is okay.
Yeah.
I thought, man, they've never watched me play golf. I can't hit anything.
9/11 was, in many ways similar to COVID. I don't think it had quite the drastic effects on society that COVID did, but perhaps, I don't know. But thinking about Muhammad, the Quran says that he is the perfect example to follow, and of course, Muslims look up to him, especially Sunni Muslims. They follow the Sunnah or the example of Muhammad. So tell us, what are the earliest mentions of Muhammad in history?
Well, the earliest datable source that mentions Muhammad is called the Doctrina Jacobi, or the Teachings of Jacob. He was a Jewish scholar of the 7th century. And just to put this in perspective, Muhammad is supposedly, well, nobody knows the exact numbers, but born about 570 AD and died about 632 AD. Well, this guy is a Jewish convert to Christianity, and he was writing his doctrines and his "How I Got to Where I Am" story. And about 634, he mentions somebody who sounds a lot like Muhammad. And I'll read it because, of course,
Okay.
just because there's a mention of the name Muhammad doesn't necessarily mean it's the same one, but most
Right.
scholars believe this is the first datable. So about 634, about 2 years after Muhammad's death, Jacob wrote, "They were saying that the prophet had appeared, coming with the Saracens, and that he was proclaiming the advent of the anointed one, the Christ who was to come. I stopped by a certain old man well versed in the scriptures, and I said to him, 'What can you tell me about the prophet who has appeared with the Saracens?' He replied, groaning deeply, 'He is false, for the prophets do not come armed with a sword. Truly, they are the works of anarchy being committed today, and I fear that the first Christ to come, whom the Christians worship, was the one sent by God, and we instead are preparing to receive the Antichrist.'"
Mhm.
So the prophet appeared among the Saracens. Saracens, they're not exactly sure the derivation of that word. It either means raiders or people from the east or things like that. So basically, it means Arabs. So a prophet has appeared among the Arabs, and he has a sword with him. Well, shortly after that, 2 years later, there's another book called Fragment on the Arab Conquest, is how the English title works out. And these are notes that were written around the year 636, so now 4 years after the time. And what they are is a Syriac Christian manuscript of the Gospel of Mark. And as you know, books were not cheap back then.
Mhm.
So what he does in the margins of his copy of the Gospel of Mark, he wrote some notes, and he said, in January, the people of Homs, and Homs is in Syria, took the word for their lives, and many villages were ravaged by the killing of the Arabs of Muhammad, and many people were slain and taken prisoner from Galilee as far as Beth. So you got two different mentions of Arabs and prophet and war from 634 and 636. And then another one that's all within 10 years of the life of the traditional date for the end of Muhammad's life. About 639, Sophronius was the patriarch of Jerusalem. And he wrote a letter, and he talked about the first wave of Arab attacks, and I'll quote that briefly. He said, "As once that of the Philistines, so now the army of the godless Saracens has captured the divine Bethlehem and bars our passage here, threatening slaughter and destruction if we leave this holy city and dare to approach our beloved and sacred Bethlehem." So we have confirmation that there were early fighters and warriors coming from the Arabs, and that one source says that they were organized around someone named Muhammad.
Mm. And that name Muhammad, of course, Muslims use it today as a name for their prophet, but it's, a lot of people think of it as a title. It means the praised one, right?
Right. That is definitely a translation of Muhammad.
Okay.
So there's a spectrum of scholarship. Of course, most Muslims tend to stick to the standard narrative about the life of Muhammad and the sources. Among Western scholars, there's the mainstream part that sees him as a real person with a lot of the details not really sure about because the sources are late. We'll get to that later, but and there's a newer growing part of the scholarship that has begun to wonder if he even existed at all as an individual. I know several people who are working on that research, and we'll see where that goes. I didn't include that in my dissertation other than a footnote because there's not enough there yet.
Well, either way, if he was a real person in history, he sounds like a really nice guy, right?
Well, it depends. There's I can't think of her name, Karen somebody. Armstrong, that's the lady.
Yeah.
She wrote that book, Muhammad, a Prophet for Our Times, in which she says all the violent stuff was made up later and that he only taught the peaceful stuff. Although it's pretty hard to discern what her criteria for deciding what he really said and what he didn't say.
Yeah.
Because basically, if he said something violent, she says, no, he didn't really say that. If he said something peaceful, she says, he really didn't say that. And other than her preference for peace, I don't understand there's no academic standard there for discerning the two.
Yeah. It's amazing how, two different people can look at the same evidence and reach two different conclusions. But
absolutely.
How about the Quran? How old would you say it is?
Well, this is actually a really tricky question.
Mm-hmm.
In some sense, there is no Quran as a single document. If you read the Wikipedia article, there's a title. Wikipedia article is a article titled "Cairo Edition," and that refers to the currently most commonly used translation of not translation, but edition of the Quran, in which they chose out of different sources to make a single Quran. What's interesting is no ancient manuscript matches that perfectly. And so the scholars of Al-Azhar, which is the oldest Islamic university in the world in Cairo, they chose one reading or pronunciation called a qira'ah, the Hafs, out of 14 or so ways of reciting the Quran. Most of those different readings are varieties in pronunciation, individual vowels, consonants. Some are differences in entire words. And the justification for having all those different readings of the Quran when they say it's been preserved eternally is a hadith, a teaching of Muhammad, where he tells his followers that the Quran was revealed in 7 aruf or modes. Yeah. Other Muslim scholars said that there were 14, or one scholar in the 10th century or so said that there were 50 versions of the Quran that were all accepted by God. So there's a sense in which it's just simply not a single Quran. As far as how old it goes, parts of it date to the 7th century when Muhammad died. Parts of it date much earlier. For instance, in 1972, they were doing construction at the Great Mosque in Sana'a, Yemen. And at that mosque, they found a cache of about 12,000 ancient manuscripts of the Quran and other works. The oldest leaves of the Quran pages, the leaves, have been dated from anywhere from 385 to 535.
Mm.
Muhammad, born in 570, so he's born 45 years after the last possible date for when that was created. And if you recall, Olin, I know you studied the Quran enough. There's sections of the Quran where Allah answers Muhammad's critics who say he's just copying the tales of the old.
Yeah.
And it turns out that some of these manuscripts, and there's definitely completely different readings than the current Quran, and in different orders and such of the ones they have. And so the Muslim standard explanation is that these are the ones that Uthman ordered destroyed when he finally put the official written Quran together. The problem with that is that some of the pages predate Muhammad by centuries. And what's interesting, besides the Quran saying that Muhammad was repeating tales of the old, is that several archaeologists and other scholars have found traces and written about a religion in the Arabian Peninsula called Abrahamism, in which Arab ethnic pride was at the center of it. And in the Quran, it says this has been revealed in Arabic, and the reason it's called Abrahamism because the focus was on one God and Abraham as the progenitor of the Arabs. And you see not just echoes. And so there are some scholars there were a couple of people who followed that religion who interacted with Muhammad according to the standard biographies of Muhammad. And so the question is, was he simply adapting? And of course, the standard Muslim explanation would be that God revealed to him all this, and he had revealed to previous groups. So it's a coincidence that there's matches. But it appears that Abrahamism was the religion that Muhammad adapted for his revelations.
Interesting. Of course, there's lots and lots of problems with the Quran. Just thinking of, some Muslims, or a lot of them believe that, the Quran is an eternal book. Mm-hmm. And all of those different dialects, would seem like a problem for that kind of thing. But tell us about the early Muslim army and why did the early Muslims try to conquer the world?
Just to get back to what you said a moment ago about the eternal book, there was a period called the Mihna back in the 9th century in which a caliph decreed that the Quran was created, and anyone who said it wasn't created had to be persecuted and had to be put in prison or killed. That lasted about 15 years until a new caliph came in, and he realized that he was losing the PR war. And so suddenly somebody found a hadith, a saying of Muhammad, in which Muhammad says anyone who says that the Quran is created is not a Muslim. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly this new hadith appears that supports the newest findings. And so they reverse the trend, and the mainstream Muslims in the majority believe the Quran as eternal, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But you mentioned about why did the Muslim army try to conquer the world? What's interesting is, once again, the sources for these ideas. The idea that it was a Muslim army, of course, that's the standard story. One of the earliest accounts of the conquest battles is called the Futuh al-Buldan, or the Opening of the Nations, by a historian named al-Baladuri. Now, Baladuri died in 892. So Muhammad died 632. This is now being written almost 3 centuries later. He's writing the story of the battles. And the reason it's called the Opening of Nations is because in the later fully formed Islamic theology, what the Muslims were doing were trying to open the hearts and eyes of the world to the truth of Islam, and that the people had been blinded by wealth or their false gods, and that the Muslims were there to free them to worship the true God. And so it was an opening. Well, that's as I mentioned, that's written almost 300 years after the fact. Well, when I began my research, I found several issues or problems with that story. First, no one called them Muslims. There's no, in the first century of Islam, there's no source that refers to Muslims. They call them Arabs, Saracens. They call them Hagarenes. They call them various synonyms for Arab. Nobody mentions religion. And of the first people who were conquered, they talked about how supportive there were of the Arab armies that poured out. There was support from the leadership of the Arab armies to build monasteries and build up churches in the early days. And even in the Muslim sources, the histories like the history of prophets and kings uh, by Al-Tabari, which is the most famous history in the Islamic side, even that they mention that the early Arab army, which is how they're now being referred to by historians because they weren't self-identifying as religious motivations. The earliest Arab army was not just believers, and I say believers because that's the word the Quran uses for them. Munamin, believers. And to give you an example of what to support this, the Quran refers to the followers of Muhammad as a Muslims less than 75 times. It refers to the followers of Muhammad as quote unquote believers over 1,000 times. So it's way more than 10 times as often they're called believers. So these believers only had to believe in the unity of God and the last day and judgment. If they believe in angels, if they believed in those, they were part of the Arab movement that came out of the peninsula. There was no theological distinctions at the time because there was no developed theology. There was a general, we believe in God and we're Arabs, and they were fighting together. So Jews, Christians, and believers all fought side by side to conquer the land. And what had happened was, and you probably aware of this yourself, the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire had been at war for the last 35 years or so, and the sides had gone back and forth across the Middle East. The Persians actually sacked Jerusalem, was how far they penetrated into Byzantine territory, and carried away pieces of the true cross. And then later, finally, when they had peace, they were both worn out. 35 years of war, they had no money, they had no armies, and the Arabs began to raid after the time of Muhammad. They began to raid outside of Arabia, and what they discovered was there was no resistance, and the towns were just giving them whatever they wanted. And eventually, I think I showed this in my research, eventually the Arabs settled in those areas. And then over a period of about 60 to 80 years, they began to try to find a way to distinguish themselves from the local residents. And they began to develop this idea of Islam as a separate religion. Whereas before it was kind of a big tent monotheism that included all the Arabs because it was an Arab religion. And then it later becomes a a small tent Islam that excludes anyone who doesn't believe that Muhammad was a prophet, etc. So when the story of the Muslims conquering is not accurate for the first 100 years at least of the Islamic Empire. And just to give you an idea, or for the people who may be watching, the armies began to leave Arabia and attack outside of it right after Muhammad's death. Starting about 634, they began to attack the outside world and raid Persia and then Syria. 732, slightly less than 100 years later, was the Battle of Tours, 35 miles from Paris. In 100 years' time, they'd already conquered the Persian Empire, the Sasanian dynasty, which had stood for almost 500 years. They'd conquered the Byzantine Empire throughout the Middle East and North Africa, which was all Byzantine. They'd conquered Spain. They conquered half of Italy, and they were making raids even into the Rhine Valley in Germany within 100 years of Muhammad's death. So it was clearly a militaristic group that initially was focused on conquest and booty, and later became focused on sustaining the energy and unifying their new kingdom through a religion. That's what I learned through my research.
Interesting. As you was sharing all that, I was, once again going back to, thinking about The reason that they might have done this was because of, this is exactly what Muhammad did. I mean,
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
when he conquered Mecca, they're following his example. Couldn't help but think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well. So it sounds like these Muslims are occupying, Christian land as well. But
well, like I said, their initial conquest, they were very friendly and supportive of Christianity.
yeah,
Although in Jerusalem they were reported to have torn down crosses because because that to them violated the unity of God idea. But they weren't anti-Christian; they were anti-Trinitarian. And
yeah,
so there's a certain segment of Western scholarship that sees them not as Muslims but as non-Trinitarian Christians.
yeah. Most of the Muslims that I've interacted with just they don't understand the Trinity, and they don't. I know I'm painting with a broad brush, but again, just my experience, most of them don't try to understand the Trinity. But that might be another rabbit trail.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh yeah.
what you shared a little bit about some sources, but what are the sources of information on the early Muslim world that maybe you haven't shared with us?
Excuse me. Most of the traditional narratives from the Muslim side have their origins in the Hadith. That is, the teachings, the sayings, the actions of Muhammad, which were passed down orally for about at least 170 years, and then eventually became part of collections afterwards. So their sources, like those histories I mentioned, Al-Tabari's and Al-Baladuri's histories, were both written based on Hadith and then other sources. Uh, Interestingly, Hadith as a subject did not become popular and did not become a formal written area of study until the Islamic Caliphate was based in formerly Persian territory. All of the earliest scholars of the Hadith were all Persian background. And so the Arabs had a history of basically two types of literature, which was poetry and what's called Akbar literature, which is and by the way, when I say Arabs literature, it was passed orally. As you can imagine, if you're living in Arabia at the time, wasn't a whole lot of writing material available. And so these things were passed orally but that was their tradition, was Akbar literature, and Akbar means great. And so what that literature is the source of pride for tribes would be to tell of the greatness of their ancestors. So that was one source of stories for the Arabs, and the other was the Hadith, the teachings of Muhammad. The prose literature, just the simple writing of histories, was introduced to the Muslim world by the Persians when they were conquered by Islam and became Muslims themselves. And so sometimes you'll see Zoroastrian attitudes towards Christianity slipping into the sources at the time. So from those, the Hadith, which were memorized and not written till much later, they built histories, they built Quranic commentaries, siras. I'm sorry, that's a biography. Quranic commentaries, Hadith collections. These were orally passed around. The earliest written collection of these Hadiths, which exist, and Muslims will sometimes mention names, but there are no copies of these other Hadith collections. The earliest one came from Malik ibn Anas. Malik died in 795. So that's the earliest collection. He wrote his Muwatta, which is the well-worn path, similar to what the word Sharia means. So Malik, after his collection, the biggest two collections, which are used throughout the Muslim world to this Sunni Muslim world to this day, the two most authoritative collections are those of Al-Bukhari and Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, Muslim. So Al-Bukhari and Muslim. Al-Bukhari died in 870.
Wow.
So it's almost 300 years after Muhammad was born, and Muslim died in 875. The other collections, they Sunnis follow six basic collections. Bukhari Muslim. They also follow Abu Dawud, Al-Tirmidhi, Al-Sugra, and Ibn Majah, which are all from later periods.
Would you say that Abu Dawood is the third most authoritative? You
I
listed it.
think so. So it's the one I
Yeah.
see quoted the most. I don't know that he's quite on the level of the first two, but I'd say he's
Right.
probably third. I would agree with that. What's interesting is when you see these stories, when you can find external either archaeology. In my research, I went through coins because coins are a very accurate representation of what people were doing. Went through the archaeological sources and the historical written sources that were contemporary, that were written and when they happened, and they find out that the hadiths contain stories that don't match up to the other Greek and Syriac text of the time. And interesting, the stories of conversions to the Islamic side came after the time of Abd al-Malik. He's the guy who built the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and he ruled from 685 to 705. And he's the one, I believe, in my research, I demonstrate that he's the one who used Islam as a separate religion, as a unifying concept for the new kingdom that was built. Before, there was no government structures. There was nothing of the sort. They were just raiding and taking over and running things as Arabs always had, based on tribal allegiances. And after Abd al-Malik, they began to have a government structure with taxes and everything else. So he's the one, I believe, began to focus on. Then you start to hear about conversions to Islam. Interestingly, one of the complaints about Ali, the final caliph of the rightly guided caliphs, what you hear about him is that one of the big complaints was that more than 6,000 of the believers went to Egypt and came out as Christians. So they went from this big tent monotheism to specifically becoming Christians, and they were indicating that there was something wrong with his leadership because people were leaving the fuzzily defined at that time religion.
Wow. Again, I'm thinking about historical sources. This is quite a bit different than
I agree. Like I said, I was surprised when I was doing my research, but I couldn't do a dissertation and put sources that were late above sources that were contemporary.
Yeah.
So there are times like Al-Tabari's History of Prophets and Kings, his universal history. He wrote that in the 10th century. When he's writing about events near his time, that's the best source for them. When he's writing about the events in the days of Muhammad, it's too distant to know for sure. And if anybody thinks that somebody memorized and passed down private conversations between people for 250 years without a problem, then I have some swampland I'd like to sell them. There are checks and balances, but as you know from the formation of Bukhari's collection, he went through more than 10 times the number he accepted as being false. So there were lots of false ones, and there's actually within the histories from the Islamic side, there's quotes from scholars from the around 730 talking about when I was young, nobody mentioned hadith, and now I'm hearing it all the time. And there's caliphs who were charged with paying scholars to create hadith to support them.
Yeah. So very, very problematic, I think, for Muslims. Of course, I'm not sure how many of them are aware of this kind of information, but
I didn't do this research to attack Islam.
right.
I just wanted to know what is the most defensible history that I can write based on sources that are correct for the time, that archaeology, numismatics, coins, and other documents and such would lend support to. What would be the most defensible recreation? And that's all I was trying to do.
Right. All right. Well, how about the differences between Sharia? You've already mentioned that Sharia means the path or the way.
Mhm.
What are the differences between Sharia and Islamic law?
That's an excellent question. This is the most misunderstood part of my research because,
Really?
well, I mean, who wants to study the legal system of something in another place that
Right.
has no effect on their daily lives? I understand that. Just to give you a little background, before I became a Navy pilot, I was originally looking to become a lawyer, and I became a Navy pilot just because I was searching for something that might be more fun than being a lawyer. And I know you're probably thinking, what could possibly be more fun than being a lawyer? So that's how I became what we call a naval aviator, was because I was looking for something else. But the legal side has always interested me, and
Yeah.
so that's what got me into this. So to and most Muslims misunderstood this, and you see the blending of the two terms constantly.
Mm.
I'll give you a quick rundown. Sharia is Allah's eternal, perfect, immutable law, can't be changed. It was revealed in part to Moses and Jesus and more entirely to Muhammad. At the same time, Islamic law is man's attempt to interpret and apply what people know of Sharia to a system of positive law. And I'll give you a quote from Professor John Esposito of Georgetown. He's part of the Islamic Studies Center at Georgetown, or the head of it. He says, Sharia refers to the divinely inspired codes, guidelines, or principles Muslims are to follow in living out their faith, combining law, religion, and ethics. Islamic law, on the other hand, refers to the practical application of Sharia in both real and hypothetical cases. To put it another way, Islamic law is the product of human reasoning in light of divinely revealed guidelines. So Islamic law can be changed, uh, and Sharia can't. Uh, there are still four mainstream Sunni schools of Islamic law. There are at times more, and several schools of Shia Islamic law. Why are there different schools of Islamic law? Because there's different ways to approach how you apply those things. To give you an example, if a person commits apostasy within Islam, all four Sunni schools agree that you have to kill them. However, some say you have to give them 3 days. Some have different numbers. Some say you give them a chance to repent. Some say different things, and some say in order to count as apostasy, he has to say this phrase, etc. So there's differences within the different schools of law. But Muhammad in the Hadith says if anyone changes his Islamic religion, kill him. And
Yeah.
that's in all the collections, especially Bukhari and Muslim, the main two. Uh, so the question is, what does change his Islamic religion? What does it take to make a legal system of that? And so the scholars would do the best they could to study the text and the biographies of Muhammad and history and everything else. And each school that formed in Sunni Islam has a different approach to how to make the law.
That's very helpful. Thank you. How about when did Islamic law begin?
Well, interestingly, the first school of Islamic, I've already mentioned the fellow Malik ibn Anas, who died in
Yeah.
795. Actually, some people date it to him. He wasn't the actual first school. I'll get to that in a second, but he had the first legal text, the Muwatta, his collection of hadith, and those dealt with religious practice and legal precepts. And that hadith collection is about 1,900 hadith. And to give you a comparison, Bukhari contains about 7,500. So Bukhari is much more complete. But the actual first school that was founded, it was the Hanifi, Hanifa, founded by Abu Hanifa al-Numan ibn Thabit, which rolls off the tongue. It's the Hanafi school, or the Hanafi school. He died in 767. So even though his school, and once again, Muhammad died 632, so the first school of Islamic law shows up 140 years, 135 years after Muhammad's time. It lets you know that Islam as a religion had not yet formulated official doctrines yet. They did not have hadith collections. They couldn't form the law until they started making hadith collections, and they did not have a prescribed legal tradition, a single one. So the first one was founded by Abu Hanifa, and that was he died what did I just say? 767? Yeah, 767.
Okay. I have spent most of my time focused on Sunni Islam. I just recently started interacting with some Shia Muslims, interacted with them in a recent trip to Florida. I was in a $20 million mosque, Shia mosque,
Wow.
but beautiful place. It's sad that
You know what's interesting is that in Islamic history, generally the Shia laws for dealing with religious minorities such as Christians are nicer than the Sunni ones. And that's because the Shia have been persecuted minorities and they know what it feels like. And so
yeah,
they actually they may have treated Christians badly at times, but their legal system was always a little nicer than the Sunni one.
yeah, okay. Well, like I said, I've most of my time and interaction with Muslims has been the Sunnis. So tell us about the four schools of Islamic law, specifically for the Sunnis. I was looking for. I have a copy of the Reliance of the Traveler here somewhere. That's
Oh,
what I was looking for.
yeah.
But tell us about these four schools.
Well, I just mentioned the first one was Abu Hanifa, and so the Hanafi school was founded by him. And when I say schools, basically a school is an approach to how to make rulings. It's not a settled series of cases. And so, to give you an example, the Hanafi school, they rank the most important source for them is the Quran, then the Prophet's Sunnah, which is understood through Hadith, companion rulings, and the practices of Medina, the consensus of the scholars, and legal reasoning and communal needs. So they balance those four sources to make a law. Malik had a different ranking of sources. I'm sorry, that I just got that backwards.
All right.
Hanafis are Quran, sound Hadith, companion opinions, and methods of legal reasoning based on the Quran and Sunnah. And the criticism of the Hanafis was that they put too much weight on legal reasoning. That is, that they made up stuff. That was the criticism of them. Malik, Hanafi school was founded in formerly Persian territory near Baghdad now, whereas Malik lived in Medina, which is where Muhammad died. And so he put the way the community there did it as a more important source. He reasoned that the people who lived with Muhammad would know better how to make these rulings than somebody in a foreign area. And so he put great weight on the consensus of the local community. Well, if you're living in far away from Medina, then you can't use the consensus of the local community. So the other schools had to have different sources. And so you see different emphasis. Like I said, the Hanafis were Quran, sound Hadith, opinions, and their own legal reasoning. The third school is the Shafi'i school. He was born in Gaza, raised in Mecca. He studied law under Malik, and actually he learned Ashal under the Hanafis in Baghdad. His order was Quran and reliable Hadith, consensus of the scholars, companions' opinions, and analogical reasoning. And basically, without getting into all the technical jibber jabber, Shafi blended the Hanafi and the Maliki schools' ways of doing things. After these schools have been going for a while, the final school, the Hanbali school, was founded, and this guy died in 855, Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He was born and educated in Baghdad. And he was a traditionist, a Hadith scholar to start with, and then he got into the law side. And because he was a Hadith scholar, he thought the Hadith, or you got the Quran number one and Hadith number two for determining law. Who cares about the consensus of people who live in Medina? We have these eternal sources from Allah. And when they asked him, "You sure that Hadith and the Quran is enough?" He said, "Why do you need when they asked him, why do you need the Hadith when you have the Quran?" He's recorded to have said, "Do you find in the book of God that the afternoon prayer comprises 4 sets, during which one does not recite aloud, the number of prayers, the amount of the alms tax, and so on? Do you find this explained in the book of God?" In other words, the Hadith are necessary to make Islamic law. And for all the schools at this point, they've all pretty close to blending in their general rulings. There's not a whole lot of difference between them over the centuries. More and more interaction between the different schools, but they all pretty much agree that the hadith are very important now. And if you look at the content of Islamic law, the vast, I'd say 70% at least comes from hadith, and maybe 30% at most comes from the Quran. Some scholars give exact numbers, and they give the hadith even more prominence than that. So the problem is, when you make Islamic law, you're using the hadith. Hadith were passed down for centuries. The vast majority of them was ruled as unreliable or dishonest, and the ones that they thought were the best ones became Islamic law. And so you can see why there's some doubt in Islamic laws, because the source has some doubt in it.
Yeah.
So the hadith became important, and interestingly, the two schools that were founded in formerly Persian territory by people from the former Persian guys who were Persians, and formerly Persian territory where Christians weren't very popular. Those schools' restrictions on Jews and Christians living in their territory was the strictest. The schools founded in the Arabian tradition, where it was more, as I mentioned, egalitarian in the beginning, where it was more big tent monotheism. The schools that come from that background tend to treat Christians and Jews much better.
Mm.
So you see a very strong political aspect to the growth of the law of the Dhimma.
Excellent. Well, tell us about this word, Dhimma. How did this concept develop over time? Maybe you could give us,
Sure.
a definition of the word.
Sure. It means treaty or obligation, and
Okay.
and like I said, in the West we call it Dhimma and Dhimmis, but the Arabic letter makes it pretty clear. The correct pronunciation is Dhimma. It's like a DZ sound together. So
Yeah.
I'll stick with Dhimma because it's easier to say. But I just want to let everyone know who's listening that I'm not ignorant of that. Well, it just means a treaty or obligation. It came to refer to the agreement between the Islamic Society for the obligations and rights of non-Muslims living there. That's what it came to mean, but that's not how it started. The term Dhimma originated in pre-Islamic Arabia. It was not something that started within Islam. It was, at the time, it was used to mean any treaty between a victorious side and the losing side, and the losing side would be granted certain rights. And the only time religion was mentioned is as maybe somebody's God would be a guarantor of the parts of the agreement of the Dhimma, but it was not, the religion had nothing to do with the agreement itself. Over time, it came to mean a religious protection, restrictions on religious minorities. Originally, in the early days, it was only people of the book, Jews and Christians, and the Quran and Hadith refers to people of the book, people who'd received the revelation of Allah, Jews and Christians, and Zoroastrians eventually. And then eventually, over the centuries, any religious minority came to be covered by that. And the laws restricted sometimes the size of a house, what clothing they had to wear, could the church ring a bell or not, and how marriages were to take place. With Jews, there was times where the law said that a Christian would have to cross the street to get out of the way of any Muslims coming his way. He could never ride a horse that was taller than a Muslim's. He could never have a house taller than a Muslim's. And certain times there were very strict restrictions on Christians.
So it came to mean a very lower status, really, it sounds like.
Yeah, it did. So the Jews and Christians were originally all part of the group to start with, and over time, after the conquest and the settlement, they began to make a stratified society with Muslims on the top, Jews and Christians, and originally anybody else that wasn't a Jew or Christian, they had to leave or die. And then over time, especially when they conquered India and established the Mughal dynasties there, you can't kill everybody who's not a Jew or a Christian in India. I mean, how do you put a couple of 100 million Hindus to death and still have a country? So, but they've adapted the law to include basically anyone who's not a Muslim at that time.
Very interesting. All right. Well, there's another very important term, jizya.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about this. Was this term from Muhammad's time?
Actually, it does not originate from the time of Muhammad.
Okay.
Before Muhammad existed in Persia, there was a poll tax, a tax on individuals who were not Zoroastrians, which was the religion of Persia. In order to pay for wars and such, they would tax the Jews and Christians living within their country, within their lands, and the Persians called it a kizyat. Well, the kizyat became a jizya when it was translated to Arabic later, and we have very early sources for this. The Babylonian Talmud, 19 sections of it mentions this kizyat. And some of these references date to the 3rd century, so
Wow.
the 200s they were already doing the kizyat. So it did not begin with Islam, but you start to really see it used as a tax. In the early days of Islam, it just meant the Arabs would conquer an area and make up a treaty, and the losing side had to send a tribute. And the early days, the Arabs called that a jizya. It was a community responsibility because they lost. Over time, as the conquerors became the rulers, they turned it into an individual tax, and that happened basically at the time when Persia was becoming more important, and they just borrowed the concept of an individual tax on Jews and Christians and called it a jizya. And the purpose is that Jews and Christians aren't required to fight in the armies, and so the Jews and Christians pay the jizya, and they get to live in the society.
Interesting. Once again, there's not a whole lot that's original to Islam, is there?
It kind of did develop within a cultural milieu that you can examine, and you can find traces and sources for a lot of the ideas.
Yeah. All right. Well, question that a lot of people ask, and I think there's a lot of confusion about the Crusades.
Mhm.
Tell us, what impact did the Crusades have on this law of the Dhamma?
Well, interestingly, I've actually written several encyclopedia articles about the Crusades, so I did a good deal of study
Okay.
on the Crusades just a few years ago. The Crusades lasted from about 1050 to 1300 for a historical. And remember, the Arab armies began to conquer about 634, so now it's 1050. So interestingly, the Middle East was not necessarily all Muslim. It wasn't even in many areas. It was very little Muslims in some areas. Some cities were still vast majority Christian even by the time of the Crusades. And people sometimes these days portray the Crusades as the European Christians invading the poor Muslims in their homes and attacking them and robbing them and killing them. But sometimes they don't fail to look at the background, which was that the Muslims, at this time it was Muslims, the Muslims had attacked Europe and had done more than 400 battles in Europe. Before the First Crusade, they had sacked Rome. This was not a distant threat to Europe. It was a constant threat. And just to give you an idea of how constant the threat was, Constantinople, the former capital of the Byzantine Empire, fell in 1453. So even after the Crusades, the Muslims were still trying to invade. As I mentioned before, the Battle of Tours in 732, that's 35 miles from Paris. So these raids and battles were happening constantly. But the immediate driver of the Crusades was that they pilgrimages to the Holy Lands had begun to become a thing in Europe. There was improvements in farming techniques which allowed them to almost double the harvest. There was increases in military hardware and military tactics, because those European countries and lands were always fighting each other, so they got better at fighting. And with the extra food and the time and they now had time when they could go do things. That's when the Crusades started, and So they began to go back into the Middle East. They were just simply trying to ensure the safety of pilgrims to Jerusalem was the initial motivation. And not all the crusades were. There were 13 numbered crusades, but there was another crusade that didn't even have a number. I wrote an article on that. It was called the Barons' Crusade, also sometimes known the Prince's Crusade because of the number of royalty that went on that one. What they did was they went to the Middle East, took a little survey of what was going on, and they realized that the Shiite kingdom based out of Egypt, the Fatimid dynasty, was at constant war with the Sunnis based out of what's now Iraq and Syria. And so what these barons did, because they weren't dummies, they went down and they said to one side, if you give us Jerusalem, we'll help you fight the other side. And then they went to the other side. The guy said, and the one side said, sure. Then they went to the other side. If you give us Jerusalem and lands to help support it, we'll help you fight the other side. And so they negotiated forcefully for about 4 years and then went home again. They got all the agreements they wanted and just left. So there was no fighting at all on one of the crusades. That's why it doesn't have a number. So they went down there. But the net effect of the crusades was to increase distrust of the indigenous Christians. The local Muslims began to see them as in league with the European Christians. And I say this as a little aside. When the crusades first happened, there was no reaction in the Muslim world. They barely even noticed it. It's not the first time you see the crusades being written up as the Europeans trying to take over our part of the world is the 19th century.
Wow.
It became a propaganda idea. The early days, they mentioned it, and you can actually trace the exaggeration where the initial accounts contemporary say that, 50 people died and this mosque was burnt. And then 100 years later, it was 300 people died and all these holy men died and they burnt the city. And then 100 years later, you see the story. That fish just kept getting bigger, Olin. And so the Crusades weren't that big a deal at the time, but they began to see Christians as untrustworthy, as wanting to destroy Islam. Excuse me. And so a scholar named Ibn Taymiyyah began to come up with extremely harsh regulations for controlling Christians and their impact.
Still a lot of animosity today between the two groups, but
there are. Many Muslims and Christians get along just great, and some don't.
We love them. That's why we do this.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we got just a couple more here. Tell us about the Pact of Umar.
Just to give you a definition, historian Mark Cohen, this is a quote for him: "The basic document outlining the obligations of the non-Muslims living in Dar al-Islam, that is, the House of Islam, the territory ruled by Islam, and defining the relationship of the al-Dhimma or dhimmis, protected people, which is what that term means, with Muslims in the Islamic State. It became the substance of the 4 schools of Islamic law to use in making their rulings on what should be, how Christians and Jews should live within an Islamic society." So this Pact of Umar, it's supposed to be an original document from Umar ibn al-Khattab, the early caliph who died in 644. And in that agreement, some Christians from Syria go up to him and say, if you put this, we recommend you put these heavy restrictions on us, and in return, we won't fight. And it's really hard to believe someone would do that. Yeah. We recommend you put these heavy restrictions on us. I mean, I'll give you a quote out of one copy of the Pact of Umar. It says, "They are forbidden to build churches or monasteries in their cities or nearby areas. They are not allowed to renovate such buildings. They must allow any Muslim to lodge in these buildings for 3 nights and provide him with food. They must never shelter a spy nor show any duplicity to Muslims. They are not to teach their children the Quran. They must not display any sign of their unbelief or forbid their relatives from freely converting to Islam." Well, this document is the source from which all 4 schools came up with their law for controlling the dhimma or regulating the dhimma. There's only one problem, is that in the 7th and 8th centuries, no Christian seems to have ever heard of this or had to follow any of these restrictions. Those don't show up till later. So there's no Byzantine or Syrian sources from the period that is supposed to have existed that mentions it. There's no contemporary historical sources that mention any of the restrictions. And a writer named John Bar Penkaye, who died in 680, so this is all shortly after this document is supposed to have written. This is what he wrote in his book at his time, and he wrote about the period under the Caliph Muawiyah, who ruled from 661 to 680. This is what the Christian guy wrote about under the rule from 661 to 680. John Bar Penkaye wrote, "Justice flourished under his reign, and a great peace was established in the countries that were under his government and allowed everyone to live as they wish. They received an order in favor of the Christians and monks. Similarly, because of this guidance, they held to the worship of one God according to the customs of the old law." So the contemporary Christian says this is the best time we've had with great justice and freedom. And then suddenly in about 850, this document supposedly from 640 or so shows up and says, oh no, you put these restrictions on yourself, you have to follow them. Well, when a document shows up for the first time 200 years after it's supposed to be written, as a person trying to make a serious historical study, I had to reject it as unhistorical. And I actually give something like 13 reasons in my research why it can't be historical. And then I put down, I think it's 6 different versions that appear in Islamic sources of that Pact of Umar, the agreement between Umar and the Christians, theoretically. I got 6 different versions, and they all have different wordings and different clauses. So it's pretty clear that no Western scholar takes the Pact of Umar seriously.
This word later seems to be a continuing theme here.
As I said, when you hear the standard narrative repeatedly, and then you start looking at the sources, and like I said, 3.5 years of study of this topic and these historical sources, just to give you an idea of how I focused my research. For me, the core of the research was the law of the Dhimma. But in order to understand that, I had to place it within Islamic law. In order to place it within Islamic law, I had to understand Islam. So you look at the development of the law of the Dhimma within the development of Islamic law, within the development of Islam. And so the core of the research is the law of the Dhimma, but it also impacted my understanding of Islamic law and Islam. And as you mentioned, the sources for early Islam on the traditional side all come centuries after the activities. And it makes sense if you think about it. If people come out of Arabia, they typically don't have a history of writing things. They have a history of oral transmission.
Right. All right. Well, one final question, a pointed question that I think everybody wants to know is the Dhimma still in existence in the Islamic world today?
Well, now that ISIS has been defeated, technically no, not officially.
Okay.
In the Ottoman Empire, which the people who took over conquered Constantinople in 1453, and they were the empire up until 1923. In 1839, the Edict of Gulhan was passed, giving all citizens the equal status. And then in 1839 to 1871, there was called the Tanzimat reforms, and it modernized the entire legal system, reducing the influence of Islamic law. By 1924, Mustafa Kemal, they call him Ataturk, father of the Turks, had abolished the caliphate, had abolished Islamic law as a source, had defunded all the Islamic schools, and declared Turkey officially in their constitution to be a secular state. And their constitution says that clause is not amendable. You cannot change. Turkey has to remain a secular state according to their constitution. So there's no official DEMA, but the attitudes and the legal restrictions exist in different places. I mean, I'll give you things are improving, like in Egypt. Just a couple of years ago, the head of the Supreme Court's a Christian.
Wow.
So, although their constitution at one time said that it had to be a Muslim as the president, it probably still does. I haven't looked at their latest constitution lately, but it's probably still does. Where you see the most restrictions on Christians is in Iran, Saudi Arabia, and even Pakistan has legal restrictions on Christians. In Saudi Arabia, they're making gestures towards opening things, but I'm on a wait and see for that one. So you see remnants of the law, the different parts, the clothing restrictions, the tax, etc., all these things. You see parts of the attitude still reflected in law, but there's no official DEMA in existence anymore.
Yeah. It's still interesting that, Iran and the Saudis can come over here and, have the freedom to build their mosque and to worship, and, really, mosques are just popping up everywhere. I gave you an example of a $20 million mosque in Sanford, Florida. But you can't go there and build a church.
That Sanford's about, I don't know, less than an hour from where I'm sitting.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, but even where I live in a small town, we have an Islamic center. I've never seen a car in the parking lot, but it's a little tiny one. I suspect it's just there so they can say they have one.
Yeah.
I've never seen a vehicle there. Although the subway guy in our town told me he's a Muslim. So I'll tell you what, after 9/11, when I became curious about the violence of the extremists, and I thought, well, that's how they act in Europe, but they don't seem to act that way in the U.S. Why?
Yeah.
And as you probably know, I'm sure you're aware, the Quran says that Muslims are to enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. That is, that they're not just to follow the Sharia, the straight path, but they're also supposed to make sure their neighbors follow the straight path.
Mm.
And so that becomes a condition in the Middle East where you have people watching each other and reporting each other and causing trouble for each other. And most of the Muslims who immigrated to the U.S. did so to kind of get away from that mindset.
Yeah.
And so they tend to be the more liberal, more peaceful versions.
Sure.
And then Europe, in the 1970s, there were stories coming out in 1980s about many of the immigrants converting to Christianity, and Saudi Arabia became concerned, and they began to build mosque and study centers and dawah centers, outreach centers, and they funded a lot of stuff to prevent it. And so people began to immigrate to Europe to stop the conversion to Christianity and to try to go the other way. So a different attitude, and I'm speaking in generalities here. Of course, no individual Muslim is going to exactly follow what I say, but in general, the Muslims who came to the U.S. came here for an opportunity, and many in Europe did, but some went there to try to extend the footprint of Islam.
Well, you used the word opportunity, regardless of why they're here. As a Christian, I think God has given us a great opportunity by bringing them to us. And we have the most powerful message in the world, and that's the gospel.
Amen. Amen. And if we're too lazy to go to them, God will bring them to us.
That's right. I think he's done that. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's interesting. My wife works at a ministry that serves cruise ships and cargo ships in this area.
Okay.
She cooks for these sailors. 40 to 60,000 foreign sailors come through that ministry a year.
Wow.
And so it breaks my heart that more churches aren't trying to support that ministry. They're just barely getting by with that many. The mission field is pouring into their doors, and the churches in the area support it enough to keep it going, but it's barely hanging on. They never have enough staff. And so if anyone's watching this, Canaveral Port Ministry, Cape Canaveral, Florida, needs your help. There's my shout out for them.
Yes, excellent. Well, brother, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. And I learned a lot, and a lot of good history there, and a lot of useful information. And pray that our listeners can take it now and use it for the glory of God.
Amen.
Any closing thoughts that you might have? Or
Yeah, I think the way I approach Muslims is I don't look at them as an enemy.
Mm.
I look at them as trapped. I look at them as if a person was raised in a neutral environment and someone showed them what Islam teaches and what Christianity teaches side by side, I think they would choose Christianity almost every time.
Yeah.
However, they've been raised that Muslims pray 6 prayers a day, 6 sets, and they pray a certain chapter of the Quran, the opening, the Fatiha,
Right.
27 times a day, in which they're praying not to become a Jew or a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that. So 27 times a day, they're praying not to become Jews or Christians. And also the Quran tells them that if a Christian tries to be friends with them, it's because they're trying to convert them. Yeah. And so they're constantly, if they're devout Muslims, they're constantly on the guard against proselytizing and Christian outreach. So it's a very thorny and tricky area to navigate. But I encourage all the people who watch this show and anyone else to learn as much as they can from Olin and other teachers, and learn the practical techniques to effectively witness to the Muslims. That's my dream.
Amen. I usually do this, and I'm going to add it in the closing here. What you said reminded me. You basically said this, but it's such a simple thing, mm-hmm. and that is the difference between Islam and a Muslim. Mm-hmm. We love Muslims. Muslims are people made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. Christ died for them. We love them, but we're not called to love Islam. Mm-hmm. God desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So mm-hmm. we can attack Islam, but mm-hmm. we don't attack Muslims, and that's what I hear you saying. Mm-hmm. Dr. Don Deal, thank you, brother. Thank you so much for the.
You're welcome, brother. It's good to see you.
You as well.
I always enjoy speaking with people who love their hairstyles the way I do.
Well, I raised 2 girls, so I had hair before that. All right, brother. Well, bless you. Have a good evening. And until next time, thank you, brother. Thank you again.
Thank you, brother, for having me. God bless.
God bless.